Marcus Rodriguez was washing dishes in his small apartment kitchen when the phone rang. He dried his hands on a dish towel and picked up the phone, expecting another sales call. Instead, a serious voice introduced himself as David Patterson, a lawyer from Montana. "I'm calling about your great-uncle Elias Rodriguez," the lawyer said. "I'm sorry to tell you that he passed away 3 weeks ago." Marcus stopped moving. He had barely known his great-uncle Elias. The old man had shown up to only 2 family gatherings that Marcus could remember. Both times Elias had sat in the corner, drinking coffee and saying very little to anyone. Marcus's mother had always said that Elias was the strange one in the family, the one who left Texas to live alone in the mountains. "I'm sorry to hear that," Marcus said, though he felt no real sadness. "But why are you calling me?" "You've been named in his will," the lawyer explained. "He left you his ranch in Montana. The property includes 40 acres of land, a main house, several smaller buildings, and a bunkhouse. There are also some personal belongings and a small amount of money." Marcus sat down hard in his kitchen chair. He worked as a mechanic in San Yao, Antonio, and lived paycheck to paycheck. The idea of owning land seemed impossible. "Are you sure? I barely knew him." "Yes, I'm certain. The will is very clear. You're his only living relative, according to our records. The property is located in the Bitterroot Valley, about 30 miles south of Missoula. It's been empty since Mr. Rodriguez passed away." The lawyer gave Marcus his address and phone number. He explained that Marcus would need to come to Montana to sign papers and decide what to do with the property. Marcus could sell it, keep it, or rent it out. The choice was his. After hanging up, Marcus sat in his kitchen for a long time. He had never been to Montana. He had never owned anything more valuable than his 10-year-old pickup truck. The whole thing felt like a dream. Marcus called his mother that evening. She was surprised to hear about the inheritance, but not shocked that Elias had left everything to Marcus. "Elias never married," she said. "He never had children. Your father was his favorite nephew, and after your father died, I think Elias felt some connection to you, even though he didn't show it." "What was he like?" Marcus asked. "I remember him being quiet, but not much else." His mother was quiet for a moment. "He was different after he moved to Montana. Before that, he was more normal. He worked construction, had friends, dated women. But something changed when he bought that ranch. He became distant, cold even. The few times I talked to him on the phone over the years, he sounded like a different person. What do you think changed him?" "I don't know. He never talked about his life up there, just said he was raising cattle and living quietly. But I always wondered if something had happened. Something he didn't want to talk about." Marcus spent the next week thinking about the inheritance. He had 2 weeks of vacation time saved up at work. His boss, Mr. Garcia, was understanding when Marcus explained the situation. "Take the time you need," Mr. Garcia said. "A ranch in Montana sounds like a good opportunity. Even if you sell it, you might make enough money to change your life." Marcus packed a bag with clothes for a week. He threw in some tools, thinking he might need to fix things at the ranch. His truck was old but reliable. The drive to Montana would take 2 days, but Marcus didn't mind. He had never taken a real road trip before. The drive north was beautiful. Marcus had never seen mountains like the ones in Colorado and Montana. The sky seemed bigger than in Texas. The air smelled different, cleaner somehow. As he got closer to Montana, he began to feel excited about seeing the ranch. Marcus reached the lawyer's office in Hamilton, Montana, on a Friday afternoon. David Patterson was a thin man with gray hair and kind eyes. He had all the papers ready for Marcus to sign. "The ranch is about 20 miles from here," Patterson explained as Marcus signed document after document. "It's pretty isolated. The nearest neighbor is about 5 miles away. Your great-uncle liked his privacy." "What kind of condition is it in?" Marcus asked. "Hard to say. I haven't been out there since the funeral. Elias didn't let many people visit, but the buildings were in decent shape the last time I saw them. The main house is small but solid. The bunkhouse where the ranch hands used to sleep is older, but still standing." Patterson handed Marcus a set of keys. These should open everything. There's a key to the main house, the bunkhouse, and the barn. The electricity is still on, and there's a well for water. Elias paid his bills automatically from his bank account, so everything should be working. Did he have ranch hands recently? Marcus asked. Patterson's expression changed slightly. He looked uncomfortable. No, not for many years. He used to hire seasonal workers, mostly in the 1980s. But after that, he worked the ranch alone. It was really more of a hobby farm by the end. He had a few cows and some chickens, but nothing big. Something in the lawyer's tone made Marcus curious, but he didn't push the question. He took the keys and directions to the ranch. The drive to. The property took Marcus through beautiful countryside. Rolling hills covered with grass stretched in every direction. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks covered with snow even in October. Marcus had never seen anything so peaceful. The ranch was at the end of a long dirt road. Marcus saw the main house first. It was a simple one-story building painted white with a green roof. It looked small but well-maintained. Behind it stood a red barn and several smaller buildings. At the edge of the property, about 100 yards from the main house, sat the bunkhouse. Marcus parked his truck near the main house and walked around the property. Everything was quiet except for the wind blowing through the grass. A few cows grazed in a field beyond the barn. The whole place felt peaceful, but somehow lonely. The main house was clean but dusty. Elias had lived simply. The furniture was old, but comfortable. The kitchen was small but had everything necessary. Marcus found coffee in the cupboard and made himself a cup while he explored. In the bedroom, Marcus found photo albums on a shelf. He flipped through pictures of Elias as a young man in Texas. There were photos of family gatherings, including some with Marcus's father, but the photos stopped around 1985. After that, the albums were empty. As evening approached, Marcus decided to stay at the ranch overnight. He could have driven back to town and found a motel, but he wanted to experience his new property. He considered sleeping in the main house, but something drew him to the bunkhouse. The bunkhouse was a long, narrow building with 4 beds along the walls. It had a small kitchen area and a separate room for storage. The building was older than the main house with rough wooden walls and floors, but it felt cozy, like a cabin in the woods. Marcus made himself dinner using supplies he had brought in his truck. As darkness fell over the valley, he sat on the bunkhouse porch and looked at the stars. He had never seen so many stars in the city. The silence was complete except for the distant sound of an owl. For the first time in years, Marcus felt something like hope. Maybe this inheritance was exactly what he needed. A chance to start over, to build something new. Tomorrow he would explore more of the property and start making plans for the future. He had no idea that this peaceful evening would be his last normal night at the ranch. Marcus woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of heavy footsteps walking across the floor above his head. He lay still in the narrow bed, listening. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth. Each step made the old wooden boards creak. Marcus sat up and looked at his watch. It was 2:30 in the morning. He had been sleeping deeply for about 4 hours. The footsteps continued, moving from one end of the building to the other, then back again. This was strange because Marcus was certain the bunkhouse was only 1 story tall. He had looked at the building from outside before dark. It had a simple, peaked roof with no second floor. Yet the sounds were definitely coming from above him. Marcus got out of bed and found his flashlight. He put on his boots and walked to the center of the room, shining the light up at the ceiling. The ceiling was made of the same rough wooden boards as the walls. There were no stairs leading to an upper floor. No ladder. No trap door. Nothing that would allow access to the space above. The footsteps stopped. Marcus stood perfectly still, holding his breath. The silence stretched for several minutes. Then the walking started again, this time moving faster. It sounded like someone was running back and forth above him. The ceiling boards groaned under the weight. Marcus went outside to look at the building from the exterior. He walked around the entire bunkhouse, shining his flashlight on the roof and walls. The building was exactly as he remembered. Single story, Simple peaked roof. No way for anyone to be walking around up there. He went back inside. The moment he closed the door, the footsteps stopped again. Marcus sat on the edge of his bed trying to think of logical explanations. Maybe there were animals in the roof space. Raccoons or squirrels could make noise that sounded like footsteps. But the sounds had been too heavy, too regular. They sounded exactly like a person wearing boots. Maybe the old building was settling. Changes in temperature could make wood expand and contract, creating sounds. But these sounds had been footsteps, not random creaking. Marcus lay back down, but he didn't close his eyes. He stared at the ceiling, waiting. After about 10 minutes, the walking started again. This time it was accompanied by voices. The voices were muffled, like people talking in another room. Marcus couldn't make out the words, but he could hear the rhythm of conversation. 2 or 3 people seemed to be talking to each other. Sometimes one voice would speak for a while, then another would respond. It sounded like they were having an argument or intense discussion. Marcus strained to hear the words, but they were too unclear. The language didn't sound like English. It might have been Spanish, but he couldn't be sure. The voices rose and fell, sometimes getting louder, sometimes dropping to whispers. Marcus grabbed his phone to record the sounds, but when he turned on the recording app, the voices stopped. He waited with the phone ready, but the silence continued. As soon as he put the phone away, the voices started again. This pattern continued for hours. Footsteps would walk back and forth above him. Voices would talk in the unknown language. Sometimes Marcus heard what sounded like furniture being moved, heavy objects dragging across the floor above. But whenever he tried to record the sounds or investigate too closely, everything would stop. Around 4 in the morning, Marcus heard a new sound. It was like someone knocking on wood, but not on the door. The knocking came from above, as if someone was hitting the ceiling from the other side. 3 quick knocks, then silence, then 3 more knocks. Marcus stood on his bed and knocked back on the ceiling. Immediately, the knocking from above became faster and more urgent. It sounded like multiple people knocking at the same time. The sound was so loud that dust fell from the ceiling boards onto Marcus's face. Marcus climbed down from the bed and back toward the door. The knocking continued for several more minutes, then suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was complete and somehow more frightening than the noise had been. Marcus spent the rest of the night sitting in a chair by the door, fully dressed with his boots on. He kept his flashlight in his hand and his truck keys in his pocket. Every few minutes he would hear small sounds, a creak here, a whisper there, but nothing as dramatic as the earlier activity. When the sun finally came up, Marcus felt exhausted and confused. He had not imagined the sounds. They had been real and clear, but they made no sense. There was no second floor, no way for people to be walking around above him. Marcus made coffee and sat on the porch looking at the peaceful morning landscape. In the daylight, the events of the night seemed impossible. The bunkhouse looked like a normal old building. Birds sang in the trees. A light breeze moved through the grass. Everything was calm and ordinary. Marcus walked around the property, trying to find some explanation for what he had experienced. He climbed on the roof of the bunkhouse and examined every inch. The roof was solid, no holes or openings, no way for anyone or anything to get inside the roof space. He went into the main house and found a ladder in the barn. Back at the bunkhouse, he set up the ladder and pushed on the ceiling boards. They were nailed down tight. He couldn't find any loose boards or hidden openings. Marcus called the lawyer, David Patterson, around 9 in the morning. "I have a strange question," Marcus said. "Did my great-uncle ever mention anything unusual about the bunkhouse?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What kind of unusual?" "I don't know. Maybe structural problems? Animals in the roof? Anything that might cause strange sounds at night?" Another pause. "Why? Are you having problems with the building?" Marcus hesitated. He didn't want to sound crazy. "I heard some noises last night, footsteps and voices, but there's no second floor, so I can't figure out where they came from." Patterson was quiet for a long time. "Mr. Rodriguez, I think you should talk to some of the local people. People who knew your great-uncle. They might be able to give you more information about the property than I can." "What kind of information?" "Historical information. About the ranch's past. About why your great-uncle stopped hiring workers." The way Patterson said this made Marcus think the lawyer knew more than he was willing to say over the phone. "Can you recommend anyone specific I should talk to?" "Try the hardware store in town. Bill Thornton has been there for 30 years. He knew your great-uncle and most of the other ranchers in the area. He's a good man to start with." After hanging up, Marcus decided to drive to town. He needed supplies anyway, and he wanted to learn more about the ranch's history. Maybe someone could explain what he had experienced. But first, Marcus wanted to try one more experiment. He decided to spend the day in town and come back to the bunkhouse for a second night. If the same things happened again, he would know he wasn't imagining them. If the night was quiet, he could assume the first night had been a coincidence or his imagination. Marcus locked up the bunkhouse and drove toward town. In his rearview mirror, he watched the building get smaller as he drove away. In the bright morning sunlight, it looked completely normal. Just an old ranch building where tired workers had once slept after long days. But Marcus knew he would never look at the bunkhouse the same way again. Something was happening in that building. Something that didn't follow normal rules. And tonight, he was going to find out what it was. As he drove down the dirt road, Marcus didn't notice the figure watching him from the window of the main house. If he had looked more carefully, he might have seen the shadow move away from the glass as his truck disappeared around the bend. The ranch settled back into its usual daytime quiet. But underneath the silence, something was waiting for darkness to fall again. Marcus drove into Hamilton just as the stores were opening for the day. The small town looked peaceful in the morning sunlight. Main Street had a hardware store, a diner, a bank, and several other small businesses. Everything moved at a slower pace than San Antonio. Marcus found the hardware store easily. A bell rang when he opened the door. The store was filled with tools, lumber, and farming supplies. It smelled like sawdust and metal. An older man with gray hair and a friendly face stood behind the counter. "You must be new around here," the man said. "I know most folks in the valley." "I'm Marcus Rodriguez," Marcus said, walking to the counter. "I just inherited my great-uncle's ranch, Elias Rodriguez. Someone told me I should talk to Bill Thornton." The friendly expression on the man's face changed immediately. He studied Marcus more carefully and his smile faded. "I'm Bill Thornton," he said slowly. "You're Elias's nephew?" "Great-nephew, actually. I barely knew him. I'm trying to learn about the property and its history." Bill looked around the store, even though they were the only two people there. He seemed to be deciding whether to say something important. "What specifically do you want to know?" Bill asked. Marcus hesitated. He still felt foolish talking about the strange sounds, but he needed answers. "I stayed in the bunkhouse last night. I heard some unusual noises, footsteps and voices, but there's no second floor. The lawyer suggested I talk to locals who might know about the building's history." Bill's face went completely serious. He walked to the front door and turned the sign to closed, even though the store had just opened. "We need to talk," Bill said. "But not here. Too many people come through. Let's go to the diner. Marge opens early, and it'll be quiet this time of day." They walked 2 blocks to a small diner called Mountain View Cafe. The owner, a woman named Marge, waved at Bill from behind the counter. She was the only person in the restaurant. "Coffee for 2, Marge," Bill called out. "And give us the corner booth. We need to talk privately." Marge brought 2 cups of coffee and left them alone. Bill stirred his coffee for a long time before speaking. "How much do you know about your great-uncle?" Bill asked. "Almost nothing. My family said he was always quiet, but he became more distant after moving to Montana. That was about 40 years ago." "That's about right. Elias came here in the early 1980s. Bought the ranch and started raising cattle. At first he seemed like a normal guy. Friendly enough, did business in town, hired local workers during busy seasons." Bill paused and looked out the window toward the mountains. But something changed in the late 1980s. Elias became different, colder. He stopped coming to town except when absolutely necessary. He stopped hiring local workers and started bringing in people from out of state. What kind of people? Migrant workers mostly. Men who needed work and didn't ask too many questions. Elias would hire them for a few months at a time, then they'd move on. At least, that's what we thought was happening. Marcus felt a chill. That had nothing to do with the cold coffee. What do you mean that's what you thought? Bill looked directly at Marcus. In 1987, 3 workers just disappeared. One day they were there, the next day they were gone. Elias said they had found work somewhere else and left without notice, but their belongings were still in the bunkhouse. Their clothes, personal items, everything. Did anyone investigate? The sheriff at the time asked Elias about it. Elias stuck to his story, said the men had left in a hurry and would probably come back for their things later. But they never did. Marcus set down his coffee cup. His hands were starting to shake slightly. What happened to their belongings? Elias said he donated them to charity after waiting a few months. But here's the strange part. After those 3 men disappeared, Elias never hired another worker. Not once in almost 40 years. He worked that ranch completely alone. That seems impossible. A 40-acre ranch is a lot of work for one person. That's what everyone thought. But Elias managed somehow. He sold off most of his cattle and kept just a few. Grew some hay, had a small garden, just enough to get by. Bill leaned forward and lowered his voice. But that's not the strangest part. After 1987, people started reporting weird things about that ranch. What kind of things? Neighbors would see lights in the bunkhouse at night even though Elias slept in the main house. Sometimes they'd hear voices carrying across the valley on quiet nights. And anyone who got close to that bunkhouse after dark said they felt like they were being watched. Marcus thought about the footsteps and voices from the night before. Did anyone ever investigate these reports? A few people tried. The sheriff went out there a couple of times in the 1990s. But Elias always had explanations. Said he used the bunkhouse for storage. That sounds carried strangely in the valley. That people were imagining things. But you don't think they were imagining things? Bill shook his head. I've lived in this valley my whole life. I know the difference between normal ranch sounds and something else. And I know when a man's behavior changes for no good reason. Marcus stared into his coffee cup, trying to process what Bill was telling him. Did the 3 missing workers have names? I remember 2 of them, Eduardo Morales and Jose Santos. The third one was younger, maybe just a teenager. I never learned his real name. Everyone just called him Miguel. Do you know anything else about them? Eduardo was the leader of the group. He spoke English pretty well and did most of the talking when they came to town for supplies. Nice guy, always polite. Jose was quieter but friendly. Miguel was shy, seemed scared of everything. They all worked hard, according to the other ranchers who talked to them. Bill finished his coffee and looked directly at Marcus. I'm going to tell you something else, and you can decide whether to believe it or not. About 10 years ago, I was driving past your uncle's ranch late at night. I saw 3 men walking around the bunkhouse, clear as day in my headlights, but when I slowed down to get a better look, they just vanished, like they had never been there. You think they were the missing workers? I think those 3 men never left that ranch, and I think they're still there. Marcus felt his stomach turn cold. Why didn't anyone do anything? Why didn't the police investigate more thoroughly? Bill's expression became sad and angry at the same time. Because they were undocumented workers in 1987. The authorities didn't care much about missing migrant workers back then. And Elias was a landowner, a taxpayer. His word carried more weight than the concerns of poor Mexican laborers. That's horrible. It was a different time. Not that it was right, but that's how things were. A lot of people suspected something bad had happened, but no one had proof. And Elias was careful never to give anyone a reason to look too closely. They sat in silence for several minutes. Marcus tried to absorb everything he had learned. The strange sounds in the bunkhouse suddenly made more sense, but in a way that terrified him. There's one more thing, Bill said. About 5 years ago, some Native American elders from the reservation came through town. They said the land around your uncle's ranch holds what they called old sorrows. Spirits that can't rest because they haven't been properly honored. What does that mean? It means that if people died on that land and their deaths were never acknowledged, their spirits might still be there, still trying to tell someone what happened to them. Marcus thought about the knocking sounds, the voices, trying to communicate in Spanish. Do you think that's what I heard last night? I think you heard Eduardo, Jose, and Miguel trying to tell their story, and I think they're going to keep trying until someone listens. Marcus paid for the coffee and they walked back to the hardware store. Bill gave him some basic supplies and his phone number. Be careful out there, Bill said as Marcus loaded his truck. If those men are still on the ranch, they're not trying to hurt you, but there might be other things you don't want to discover. What do you mean? I mean, if 3 men were murdered on that property, there might be evidence that someone doesn't want found. Evidence that could send a living person to prison if Elias had help, or evidence that could destroy reputations even now. Marcus drove back to the ranch with his mind racing. Everything Bill had told him painted a picture of something much darker than strange sounds in an old building. If the 3 workers had been murdered, their bodies might still be somewhere on the property. As Marcus pulled into the ranch driveway, he looked at the bunkhouse with new eyes. It wasn't just an old building anymore. It might be a crime scene. A place where 3 innocent men had lost their lives and been forgotten by almost everyone, but Marcus was determined not to forget them. If Eduardo, Jose, and Miguel were trying to tell their story, he was going to listen. And if their deaths had never been properly investigated, maybe it was time for the truth to finally come out. That evening, as darkness fell over the valley, Marcus prepared to spend another night in the bunkhouse, but this time he wouldn't be afraid of the sounds. He would be ready to hear what the dead men were trying to tell him. Marcus spent the afternoon carefully examining the bunkhouse in daylight. Armed with what Bill Thornton had told him, he looked at the building with different eyes. Instead of just trying to explain the strange sounds, he was now looking for evidence of what might have happened to 3 missing men. The bunkhouse was about 30 feet long and 15 feet wide. It had 4 metal bed frames along the walls, a small kitchen area with a sink and stove, and a storage room at the back. The floors were made of wide wooden boards that looked old but solid. Marcus started his investigation in the storage room. It was about 8 feet square, with shelves along 2 walls and a small window. Most of the shelves were empty, but Marcus found some old ranch equipment, a few dusty tools, and several cardboard boxes. The boxes contained mostly junk, old magazines from the 1980s, broken equipment, and various ranch supplies. But in the third box, Marcus found something interesting. It was a small notebook with entries written in Spanish. The handwriting was neat and careful. Marcus's Spanish was limited, but he could make out some words. The notebook seemed to be a work diary. It had dates from early 1987 and notes about daily tasks: feeding cattle, fixing fences, repairing equipment. The last entry was dated April 10th, 1987. Marcus put the notebook in his pocket and continued searching. Under a pile of old rags, he found something that made his heart race. It was a wallet, old and cracked but still intact. Inside was a driver's license from Mexico with the name Eduardo Morales and a photo of a serious-looking man in his 30s. The license was dated 1985. According to Bill Thornton, Eduardo had disappeared in 1987. If he had left the ranch voluntarily, why would he leave his wallet behind? Marcus searched more carefully. In the corner behind one of the shelves, he found a small wooden cross on a chain. It was the kind of religious jewelry that many Mexican workers wore. The silver had turned black with age, but Marcus could still make out a tiny inscription on the back. Jose. Now Marcus had personal belongings from 2 of the 3 missing men: Eduardo's wallet and Jose's cross. These were not items that people would abandon if they were leaving voluntarily for new jobs. Marcus turned his attention to the storage room floor. The wooden boards looked the same as the rest of the bunkhouse, but as he examined them more closely, he noticed something strange. The boards in the storage room appeared newer than the boards in the main room. They were a slightly different color, and the nail heads looked shiny compared to the rusty nails elsewhere. Marcus went to his truck and got a crowbar from his toolbox. He had to know what was under those floorboards. The first board came up easily. Too easily. The nails weren't deep, as if the board had been removed and replaced recently. Under the board, Marcus saw dark earth instead of the concrete foundation he expected. Marcus pulled up 3 more boards, creating a hole about 2 feet square. He used his flashlight to look into the space below. What he saw made him step back quickly. There were bones in the dirt, not animal bones. These looked too straight and smooth, and mixed with the bones were pieces of cloth, a leather boot, and something that glinted in the flashlight beam. Marcus climbed down into his truck and sat for several minutes trying to calm down. He had found human remains under the bunkhouse floor. The 3 missing workers hadn't left for other jobs. They had never left the ranch at all. After taking several deep breaths, Marcus forced himself to go back inside. He needed to see what else was hidden under the floor, but he also knew he should probably call the police immediately. Marcus decided to document everything before calling authorities. He used his phone to take photos of the notebook, the wallet, and the cross. Then he carefully photographed the opened floorboards and what he could see underneath. Using a stick, Marcus gently moved some of the dirt aside to get a better view. The bones were definitely human. He could see what looked like ribs and part of an arm. The piece of cloth was blue, like work clothes. The leather boot was brown and looked like it would fit a man's foot. The glinting object was partially buried, but Marcus could see enough to identify it. It was a pocket watch on a chain. He carefully brushed dirt away from the surface and saw an inscription. Para Eduardo, con amor, Maria. Marcus sat back on his heels. Eduardo's watch, given to him by someone named Maria with love. A personal treasure that no one would leave behind voluntarily. Marcus took more photos, then carefully replaced the floorboards. He didn't want to disturb the scene any more than necessary. This was evidence of a crime, and it needed to be handled properly by professional investigators. But before calling the police, Marcus wanted to understand more about what had happened. The notebook might contain clues about the workers' final days, and there might be more evidence elsewhere on the property. Marcus spent the rest of the afternoon searching the bunkhouse more thoroughly. He found a few more small items: a button from a work shirt, a broken comb, a small coin with Mexican writing. Each item suggested that people had lived in this building and left suddenly, abandoning their personal belongings. In the main room, Marcus noticed that the floorboards near the storage room also looked newer than the rest. He used his crowbar to lift one of these boards and found more disturbed earth underneath. The replacement flooring covered a much larger area than he had originally thought. Marcus realized that the entire storage room floor and part of the main room floor had been replaced after the workers disappeared. Someone had buried the 3 men under the bunkhouse and then installed new flooring to hide the grave. As evening approached, Marcus faced a difficult decision. He could call the police immediately and let them handle the investigation. Or he could spend one more night in the bunkhouse listening for the voices of the dead men, trying to understand exactly what had happened to them. Marcus chose to stay. He felt that Eduardo, Jose, and Miguel had been waiting almost 40 years for someone to find them. They deserved to have their story heard before the official investigation began. Marcus made himself dinner and prepared for another night of supernatural activity. But this time he wasn't afraid. He was angry. 3 innocent men had been murdered and buried like animals. Their families had probably never learned what happened to them. They had been forgotten by almost everyone except a few local people, who suspected the truth but couldn't prove it. As darkness fell, Marcus sat in the bunkhouse with Eduardo's notebook, trying to translate more of the Spanish entries. Gradually, a picture emerged of the workers' final days. The early entries were routine, notes about cattle, weather, daily tasks. But the later entries showed growing concern. Eduardo wrote about problems with El Patron, the boss. There were references to unpaid wages and arguments about working conditions. The entry for April 8th mentioned a meeting with El Patron about money owed to the workers. The entry for April 9th was brief. El Patron está enojado. Tenemos miedo. The boss is angry. We are afraid. The final entry, April 10th, was just 2 words. Dios ayúdanos. God help us. Marcus closed the notebook and waited for the sounds to begin. He didn't have to wait long. As the clock approached midnight, he heard the familiar footsteps above him. But this time, Marcus listened differently. He tried to hear the story the dead men were telling. The footsteps moved back and forth, as if someone was pacing with worry. The voices, when they started, sounded urgent and distressed. Marcus couldn't understand the Spanish words, but he could hear the emotion. Fear, anger, pleading. At one point, the voices became very loud, as if the men were arguing with someone. Then there was a different sound. Heavy impacts, like objects hitting the floor. The sounds of a fight. Then silence. Marcus understood. He was hearing the last moments of Eduardo, Jose, and Miguel's lives. They were replaying their deaths, over and over, trying to tell someone what had happened to them. Marcus stood up and spoke aloud to the empty room. "I found you," he said. "I know what happened. I'm going to make sure the truth comes out." The bunkhouse became completely quiet. For the first time since Marcus had arrived at the ranch, the night passed without any supernatural sounds. It was as if the three men had finally been heard and could rest, at least temporarily. In the morning, Marcus would call the authorities and begin the process of bringing justice for Eduardo, Jose, and Miguel. But first, he needed to prepare himself for what would come next. Because if his great-uncle Elias had murdered three men, there were probably other secrets buried on this ranch, and someone might not want those secrets to be discovered. Marcus woke early and drove straight to town. He needed to find more information about the three missing workers before calling the police. At the library, he searched through old newspapers and county records, looking for any mention of Eduardo Morales, Jose Santos, and the third worker called Miguel. The Hamilton newspaper archives were stored on microfilm. Marcus spent hours scrolling through newspapers from 1987, looking for any stories about missing persons or ranch workers. He found very little. There was one small article from May 1987 titled, "Local Rancher Reports Missing Workers." The article was only 3 paragraphs long. It stated that Elias Rodriguez had reported that 3 seasonal workers had left his ranch without notice in April. The workers were described as Mexican nationals who had been employed for approximately 6 months. The article mentioned that their belongings had been left behind, but that this was not uncommon among transient agricultural workers. There was no follow-up article. No investigation reported in the paper. The 3 men had simply disappeared. From the public record, Marcus then searched through county employment records and tax documents. He found evidence that Elias had indeed employed seasonal workers from 1983 to 1987. The record showed payments to several different workers, including Eduardo Morales and Jose Santos. But after April 1987, there were no more records of employee payments. Marcus also found something interesting in Elias's tax records. In late 1987, Elias had claimed a large deduction for building maintenance and improvements. The amount was substantial, nearly $10,000. This would have been enough money to replace flooring throughout the bunkhouse and make other changes to hide evidence. Around noon, Marcus decided he had enough information to contact authorities. He drove to the sheriff's department in Hamilton and asked to speak with the sheriff. Sheriff Janet Morrison was a woman in her 50s with gray hair and intelligent eyes. She listened carefully as Marcus explained what he had found at the ranch. He showed her the photos on his phone, the notebook, the wallet, and the cross. Sheriff Morrison studied the evidence for several minutes. "These are serious allegations. Mr. Rodriguez, you're suggesting that 3 men were murdered on your property almost 40 years ago. I know how it sounds," Marcus said. "But the evidence is there. The personal belongings, the human remains under the floor, the work diaries showing their fear in the final days. And the local people have suspected something was wrong for decades. Tell me about these local suspicions." Marcus repeated what Bill Thornton had told him about the disappearance, the strange reports of lights and voices, and the general feeling that something bad had happened at the ranch. Sheriff Morrison took notes while Marcus talked. When he finished, she sat quietly for several minutes thinking. "I'm going to be honest with you," she finally said. "Cases this old are very difficult to investigate. Physical evidence degrades over time. Witnesses die or forget details. And proving what happened decades ago is challenging under the best circumstances. But you'll investigate? Yes. Based on what you've shown me, we have probable cause to search the property and examine what's under those floorboards. I'll contact the State Crime Lab and the FBI. If there are human remains on your property, we need to determine how they got there. Sheriff Morrison asked Marcus not to return to the ranch until the investigation team could secure the scene. She gave him the name of a motel in town where he could stay while the experts did their work. Marcus spent that afternoon at the motel, calling his mother to tell her what he had discovered. She was shocked but not entirely surprised. "I always wondered what changed Elias," she said. "He was never quite the same after moving to Montana. More paranoid, more secretive. I thought maybe he was just getting old and set in his ways, but this explains a lot." "Did he ever talk about employing workers?" "Not that I remember. He always said he worked the ranch alone. I thought that was strange for such a large property, but I didn't question it. I think he was covering up what he had done." Living with the guilt and fear of being discovered, Marcus's mother was quiet for a long moment. Those poor men, and their families back in Mexico probably never knew what happened to them. The next morning, Sheriff Morrison called Marcus. The investigation team had arrived at the ranch and begun their work. They had found human remains exactly where Marcus had indicated, and the initial examination suggested the bones belonged to 3 different people. "We're treating this as a crime scene now," Sheriff Morrison said. "It's going to take time to process everything properly. We'll need dental records or DNA samples to identify the remains, and we'll need to carefully document the scene for any future prosecution." "Prosecution? But Elias is dead." "True, but there might have been other people involved. Or there might be civil implications for the families of the victims. We need to do this investigation properly." Over the next several days, Marcus stayed in town while the investigation continued. The story quickly became news throughout the valley. Local television stations sent reporters to cover the discovery of the bodies. Newspapers in Missoula and other cities picked up the story. Marcus was interviewed several times, but he was careful to stick to the facts. He explained how he had inherited the ranch, heard strange sounds, and discovered evidence of the missing workers. He didn't mention the supernatural aspects of his experience. He didn't think anyone would believe him, and it wasn't necessary for the investigation. Bill Thornton visited Marcus at the motel and brought him local newspapers covering the story. "I'm glad the truth is finally coming out," Bill said. "A lot of people in this valley have wondered about those missing workers for decades. Did you know Elias well enough to understand why he might have killed them?" Bill thought about this question carefully. Elias was always cheap about paying workers. Other ranchers complained that he tried to hire people for less money than anyone else would pay, and he had a temper, especially when he was drinking. If the workers had demanded their full wages or threatened to report him for labor violations, I could see him getting violent. Violent enough to kill 3 people? I don't know. Murder is different from just having a bad temper, but people can do terrible things when they're desperate or cornered. A week after the investigation began, Sheriff Morrison called Marcus with an update. "We've confirmed that the remains belong to 3 adult males, probably in their 20s or 30s. The condition of the bones suggests they died approximately 30 to 40 years ago, which matches your timeline. Have you been able to identify them?" "We're working on it. We found more personal items during the excavation, including items that probably belonged to the 3rd victim. And we've contacted authorities in Mexico to see if we can locate family members who might provide DNA samples." Sheriff Morrison paused before continuing. "There's something else you should know. We found evidence that the men didn't die from natural causes. Some of the bones show signs of blunt force trauma. This was definitely a homicide." Marcus felt sick. Even though he had suspected this, hearing it confirmed made the crime feel more real and horrible. "Do you have any idea exactly what happened?" "We're still analyzing the evidence, but the preliminary findings suggest the men were beaten to death with something heavy, probably a tool or piece of farm equipment. The attack was severe enough to break bones and fracture skulls." Marcus tried to imagine the scene. 3 men, probably demanding their wages, confronted by his great-uncle, an argument that escalated into violence. A moment of rage that destroyed 3 lives and haunted the ranch for decades. What happens next? We continue the investigation. We'll try to identify the victims and contact their families. We'll document everything for the historical record, and we'll determine if anyone else was involved in the crime or the cover-up. Marcus returned to the ranch 2 weeks later, after the investigation team had finished their work. The bunkhouse looked different now. The floorboards had been removed and replaced by the crime scene team. Yellow police tape still surrounded parts of the building, but something else had changed. The ranch felt peaceful in a way it hadn't before. The oppressive atmosphere that Marcus had sensed from his first night was gone. The spirits of Eduardo, Jose, and Miguel seemed to have found some rest now that their story was being told. Marcus walked through the bunkhouse one final time. The place where 3 innocent men had lived their final days and died violent deaths. The place where they had been buried and forgotten for almost 40 years. "Your names will be remembered," Marcus said aloud. "Your families will know what happened to you. Justice might be 40 years late, but it's finally coming." That night, Marcus slept peacefully in the main house. There were no footsteps, no voices, no knocking sounds. The supernatural activity that had brought him to this discovery had ended. The dead men had accomplished what they needed to do. But Marcus knew his work was just beginning. The investigation had revealed the crime, but now came the harder task of finding justice for the victims and closure for their families, and Marcus was determined to see that through to the end. 3 weeks after the initial discovery, Sheriff Morrison called Marcus with important news. The FBI had taken over the investigation because it involved potential violations of federal laws regarding migrant workers. A team of specialists had arrived from the regional office in Salt Lake City. "They want to meet with you this afternoon," Sheriff Morrison said. "Agent Sarah Chen is leading the investigation. She has experience with cold cases and crimes involving immigrant victims." Marcus met Agent Chen at the sheriff's office. She was a woman in her 40s with short black hair and a serious but kind demeanor. She had brought several boxes of evidence and a laptop computer. "Mr. Rodriguez, thank you for your cooperation with this investigation," Agent Chen said. "Your discovery has opened up a case that should have been investigated properly 40 years ago. We're going to do everything we can to get justice for these victims." Agent Chen showed Marcus photos of all the evidence that had been recovered from the bunkhouse. In addition to the items Marcus had found, the FBI team had discovered more personal belongings buried with the bodies. A second wallet belonging to Jose Santos, a small Bible written in Spanish, several pieces of jewelry, and work tools that had belonged to the 3 men. "We've also found something very significant," Agent Chen said. She opened her laptop and showed Marcus a document. "This is Eduardo Morales' work diary. Our translator has gone through the entire notebook, and the final entries tell a clear story of what happened." Agent Chen read from the translation. "April 7th, El Patron refuses to pay us for March work, says business is bad and we must wait, but we need money to send home to families. April 8th, we demanded our wages today. El Patron became very angry and said we should be grateful for work. He threatened to call immigration if we caused trouble. April 9th, El Patron said he will pay us tomorrow, but we must leave the ranch immediately after. We are afraid something is wrong. Jose wants to go to town and ask for help, but Miguel is too scared. April 10th, El Patron called us to the barn after dinner, said he has our money. God help us." Marcus felt a chill listening to Eduardo's final words. He knew something bad was going to happen. "Yes, and based on where we found the bodies and other evidence at the scene, we believe your great-uncle lured the 3 men to the bunkhouse with the promise of paying their wages. Instead, he attacked them with what appears to have been a sledgehammer or similar tool." Agent Chen showed Marcus crime scene photos. The forensic evidence suggests this was not a fight that got out of hand. This was a planned attack. Elias Rodriguez murdered these 3 men in cold blood to avoid paying them the money he owed. How much money was he trying to avoid paying? According to Eduardo's records, they were owed approximately $1,800 total for 6 weeks of unpaid work. Your great-uncle committed triple murder to avoid paying $1,800. Marcus stared at the evidence photos, trying to understand how someone could value human life so little. $1,800 was nothing compared to the cost of 3 lives and 40 years of haunted guilt. Have you been able to identify all 3 victims? Yes. Eduardo Morales, age 32, from Michoacan, Mexico. Jose Santos, age 28, from the same state. And Miguel Hernandez, age 19, also from Michoacan. They were all cousins who had traveled to the United States together looking for work. Agent Chen opened another file. We've been in contact with authorities in Mexico, and we've located family members of all 3 victims. Eduardo's wife Maria is still alive. She's 89 years old now. Jose's sister Carmen is 75. Miguel's mother Rosa is 82. They never knew what happened? No. The families reported the men missing to local police in Mexico in 1987, but there was no cooperation between Mexican and U.S. authorities at that time for cases involving migrant workers. The families assumed the men had died in accidents or been killed by criminals somewhere in the United States. Agent Chen pulled out photographs of the 3 families. Maria Morales never remarried. She spent 40 years waiting for her husband to come home or send word. Carmen Santos raised Jose's 2 children alone, telling them their father had died working in America. Rosa Hernandez lost her youngest son and never recovered from the grief. Marcus looked at the photos of the elderly women. Their faces showed decades of worry and sadness. Have you told them what we found? Yes, through Mexican authorities and family members who speak English. They want to know if they can come to the United States to see where their loved ones died, and to bring the remains back to Mexico for proper burial. Of course they can come. I'll help with any costs. That's very generous. But there are legal complications. None of these women have passports or visas. Getting permission for them to enter the United States, even for a family emergency, could take months or years. Marcus felt frustrated by the bureaucracy that was preventing grieving families from finding closure. There has to be something we can do. We're working on it. The State Department has special provisions for cases like this, but the process is slow. In the meantime, we're continuing our investigation here. Agent Chen showed Marcus more evidence that the FBI team had discovered. We found financial records in your great-uncle's house that show he had money problems in 1987. He owed significant debts to equipment dealers and feed suppliers. Paying the workers their full wages might have pushed him into bankruptcy. So, he killed them for money he didn't even have. It appears so. But here's what's really disturbing. After murdering the 3 men, Elias Rodriguez applied for agricultural subsidies from the federal government, claiming he had employed and paid seasonal workers. He collected over $5,000 in subsidies based on false claims about the workers he had killed. Marcus felt sick. He profited from their deaths. Yes. And that's a federal crime that we can still prosecute, even though the statute of limitations has expired on the murders themselves. If we can prove that anyone helped him cover up the crime or participated in the false subsidy claims, they could still face charges. Agent Chen leaned forward. We need your help with something. We want to search the rest of your property thoroughly. There might be more evidence hidden somewhere else. Letters, records, photographs, anything that could help us understand exactly what happened and whether anyone else was involved. Marcus agreed immediately. Search anywhere you want. I want the whole truth to come out. Over the next several days, FBI agents searched every building on the ranch. They used ground-penetrating radar to look for other burial sites. They examined every document in the main house. They interviewed neighbors and former ranch hands who had worked in the area during the 1980s. The search revealed more disturbing evidence. In the main house attic, agents found a locked metal box containing Eduardo's original employment documents, including copies of fake Social Security cards that Elias had created for the workers. There were also photographs of the 3 men working on the ranch, smiling and looking healthy just weeks before their deaths. Most damaging was a handwritten note in Elias's own writing, found hidden behind a loose board in the barn wall. The note read, E, J, and M buried under bunkhouse storage, room. Replaced flooring May 1987. Told everyone they left for California. No one will look for them here. The note was dated May 15, 1987, just over a month after the murders. It was clear evidence that Elias had planned the cover-up carefully and believed he had committed the perfect crime. Agent Chen showed Marcus the note during one of their meetings. This proves premeditation and shows that your great-uncle believed he would never be caught. He was probably right, if you hadn't inherited the property and experienced those unusual sounds. Marcus thought about the supernatural activity that had led him to discover the bodies. "Do you believe in ghosts, Agent Chen?" She smiled slightly. "I believe in justice, Mr. Rodriguez. However you found these victims, the important thing is that they've finally been found. Their families will have answers, and their story will be part of the official record." What happens next? We close our investigation and prepare a full report for the Department of Justice. We'll recommend that the case be classified as solved, with Elias Rodriguez identified as the perpetrator. We'll also recommend that the families of the victims be given every assistance in recovering the remains and obtaining any available compensation. Agent Chen gathered her papers and prepared to leave. "There's one more thing, Mr. Rodriguez. The Mexican consulate has been in contact with us. They want to recognize your efforts in solving this case and helping the victims' families find closure. They're planning a ceremony to honor Eduardo, Jose, and Miguel, and they want you to participate." Marcus felt honored but also sad. "I just wish it hadn't taken 40 years for the truth to come out." Justice delayed is still justice, Mr. Rodriguez, and sometimes it takes someone like you, someone willing to listen to voices that others couldn't hear, to make sure the truth finally emerges. That evening, Marcus sat on the porch of the main house and looked across the valley toward the mountains. The ranch felt different now that the investigation was complete. The weight of hidden secrets was gone. The land could finally be at peace, and tomorrow, Marcus would begin planning for the family's visit and the repatriation of the remains to Mexico. 6 months after the discovery of the bodies, Marcus received a call that changed everything. Agent Chen's voice was excited as she delivered the news. "The State Department has approved emergency visas for the families," she said. "Maria Morales, Carmen Santos, and Rosa Hernandez will be able to come to Montana next month. They'll be accompanied by a priest from their village and a representative from the Mexican consulate." Marcus felt a mix of joy and nervousness. How long will they be able to stay? 2 weeks. Long enough to see where their loved ones lived and died, to participate in a memorial service, and to accompany the remains back to Mexico for proper burial. Marcus had spent the previous 6 months preparing for this moment. He had learned basic Spanish so he could communicate with the families. He had researched Mexican funeral traditions so he could help organize an appropriate memorial service. And he had completely renovated the ranch house to provide comfortable accommodations for the visiting families. The Mexican consulate had worked closely with Marcus to plan the visit. They wanted the families to feel honored and respected after decades of not knowing what had happened to their loved ones. The consulate had also arranged for the remains to be transported to Mexico in specially prepared coffins, with full diplomatic honors. Marcus drove to the airport in Missoula to meet the families. He carried a sign with the names Morales, Santos, Hernandez written in both English and Spanish. He wore his best suit and carried flowers for each of the 3 women. The families emerged from the plane looking tired but determined. Maria Morales was a tiny woman with white hair and kind eyes. Despite her age, she walked with strength and dignity. Carmen Santos was taller and moved more slowly, but her face showed the same determination. Rosa Hernandez was the youngest of the 3, but grief had aged her beyond her years. With them was Father Miguel Gonzalez, a priest in his 60s who had known all 3 families for decades. He spoke some English and served as translator. Also accompanying them was Elena Vasquez from the Mexican consulate, a woman in her 40s who specialized in helping families recover remains of Mexican citizens who had died in the United States. Marcus greeted each family member individually, offering the flowers and expressing his sorrow for their losses in his careful Spanish. The women were polite but reserved. They were still processing the fact that after 40 years, they finally knew what had happened to their loved ones. The drive to the ranch took 2 hours. During the trip, Father Gonzalez translated as the families shared memories of Eduardo, Jose, and Miguel. Marcus learned that Eduardo had been saving money to buy a small farm in Mexico. Jose had planned to bring his children to the United States once he had earned enough money. Miguel had been supporting his mother and younger siblings and dreamed of becoming a teacher. They were good men, Maria said through Father Gonzalez. They worked hard and sent money home to their families. They did not deserve to die so far from home. When they arrived at the ranch, Marcus gave the families a complete tour. He showed them the main house where Elias had lived, the barn where the men had worked, and finally the bunkhouse where they had lived and died. The bunkhouse had been completely renovated since the investigation. The FBI had removed the original flooring as evidence, and Marcus had installed new floors, painted the walls, and furnished the building with comfortable beds and modern appliances. But he had also created a small memorial area where the bodies had been found. The memorial consisted of 3 wooden crosses with the names Eduardo Morales, Jose Santos, and Miguel Hernandez carved into them. Between the crosses was a plaque that read in Spanish and English, "In memory of 3 men who came seeking work and found death. Their courage in life and their voices in death brought justice and peace." The 3 women stood before the memorial for a long time, crying and praying. Maria placed a photograph of Eduardo at the base of his cross. Carmen left a rosary that had belonged to Jose. Rosa brought a small wooden toy that Miguel had made for his youngest brother before leaving for America. Father Gonzalez conducted a prayer service in the bunkhouse, asking God to comfort the families and grant peace to the souls of the 3 men. Marcus participated as best he could, feeling honored to be included in this sacred moment. That evening, Marcus prepared a meal using recipes that Elena Vasquez had helped him learn. Traditional Mexican foods that the families would find comforting. As they ate together, the formality gradually disappeared. The families began to see Marcus not as the relative of their loved one's killer, but as the person who had brought them truth and justice. "We do not blame you for what your uncle did," Maria told Marcus through Father Gonzalez. "You have given us a great gift by finding our men and telling their story." Over the next several days, the families visited every part of the ranch. They walked the fields where Eduardo, Jose, and Miguel had worked. They saw the cattle that the men had cared for. They stood in the places where their loved ones had spent their final months. Marcus had arranged for a larger memorial service to be held at the Catholic Church in Hamilton. The entire community was invited, including all the local people who had suspected something was wrong at the ranch for decades. Bill Thornton gave a speech about the importance of treating all workers with dignity and respect. Sheriff Morrison talked about the need to investigate disappearances thoroughly, regardless of the victim's immigration status. The most powerful moment came when Maria Morales spoke, with Father Gonzalez translating her words. "My husband, Eduardo, was a proud man who worked hard for his family," she said. "He came to America with hope in his heart and love for his family. He did not deserve to die in violence and be forgotten. But Marcus Rodriguez heard our men calling from their graves and brought them back to us. For this, we are grateful." Carmen Santos spoke next. "My brother Jose was a gentle man who loved his children more than life itself. He died believing he was making a better future for them. His death was a crime, but his life was beautiful. Now we can bury him properly and his spirit can rest." Rosa Hernandez was the last to speak. "My son Miguel was just a boy when he came north. He was brave and good. I have grieved for him every day for 40 years. Now I know what happened to him, and I can grieve properly and then let him go." The memorial service concluded with the presentation of the remains to the families. Agent Chen and the FBI had worked to ensure that each family received all the personal belongings that had been found with their loved ones. Eduardo's pocket watch was returned to Maria. Jose's cross was given to Carmen. Miguel's family received the small Bible he had carried. The most difficult moment came when the families had to say goodbye to the ranch. They knew they would never return to this place, but it was where their loved ones had lived their final days. It was important to them to leave properly. Marcus drove the families back to the airport, accompanied by the coffins containing the remains of Eduardo, Jose, and Miguel. At the airport, a small ceremony was held to transfer custody of the remains to the Mexican authorities. Elena Vasquez from the consulate made a brief speech. These 3 men came to America seeking opportunity and found tragedy instead. But their story did not end with their deaths. Through the courage of Marcus Rodriguez and the persistence of their families, justice has finally been served. Their names will be remembered, and their deaths will not be forgotten. As the families prepared to board their plane, Maria Morales approached Marcus one final time. She pressed something into his hand, a small wooden cross similar to the one Jose had worn. "This was Eduardo's," she said in English, surprising Marcus with words she had been practicing. "For you. Thank you for bringing my husband home." Marcus watched the plane take off, carrying the 3 families and the remains of their loved ones back to Mexico. He felt sad to see them go, but also satisfied that he had been able to help them find closure after 4 decades of uncertainty. The following week, Marcus received a letter from Father Gonzalez with photographs from the burial service in Mexico. Eduardo, Jose, and Miguel had been buried together in the village cemetery, with the entire community attending the funeral. Their graves were marked with beautiful headstones that told their stories and honored their memories. The letter also included a message from the families. They had established a small scholarship fund in memory of the 3 men to help young people in their village get an education. They wanted something positive to come from their loved ones' deaths. Marcus contributed money to the scholarship fund and arranged for annual donations from the ranch's income. It seemed like the right way to honor the memory of 3 men who had died pursuing the dream of a better life. The ranch was finally at peace. The voices that had called out from their hidden graves had been heard. Justice had been served, even if it came 40 years too late. And 3 families had finally been able to say goodbye to the men they had never stopped loving. 1 year after the discovery of the bodies, Marcus stood in the same spot where he had first heard the mysterious footsteps in the bunkhouse. The building looked completely different now. What had once been a place of death and secrets had been transformed into something that honored life and hope. Marcus had decided not to sell the ranch. Instead, he had quit his job in Texas and moved to Montana permanently. The property had become his life's work, but not in the way anyone might have expected. The Eduardo Morales Memorial Farm was now a thriving nonprofit organization that provided fair wages and safe housing for migrant agricultural workers. The renovated bunkhouse served as comfortable quarters for up to 12 seasonal workers. Each room had proper beds, heating, and private bathrooms, luxuries that many farm workers never experienced. Marcus had learned that the problems that led to Eduardo, Jose, and Miguel's deaths were still common throughout American agriculture. Many migrant workers still faced unpaid wages, unsafe working conditions, and employers who threatened them with deportation if they complained. Marcus was determined that his ranch would be different. The workers who came to the memorial farm were treated with dignity and respect. They received fair wages, paid on time, safe housing, and legal protections. Marcus had partnered with immigrant rights organizations to ensure that workers knew their rights and had someone to call if they experienced problems. Marcus had also hired Bill Thornton as the farm's manager. Bill's knowledge of local agriculture and his reputation in the community helped establish the memorial farm as a model for ethical farming practices. Together, they had developed programs that other ranchers in the valley were beginning to adopt. "You've changed how people think about farm labor around here," Bill told Marcus as they walked through the fields one morning. "Other ranchers are starting to realize that treating workers fairly is good for business." The transformation hadn't been easy. Marcus had used his own savings and money from selling his possessions in Texas to fund the initial renovation. He had also received grants from foundations that supported immigrant rights and sustainable agriculture. The Mexican consulate had provided additional funding to honor the memory of the 3 murdered workers. The hardest part had been learning to farm. Marcus knew nothing about raising cattle or growing crops when he inherited the ranch. He had spent months taking agriculture classes and working with experienced farmers to learn the basics. There had been many mistakes and failures, but gradually the memorial farm had become successful. The farm now raised organic beef cattle and grew hay and vegetables. Everything was done using sustainable practices that protected the environment. while providing good jobs for workers. The farm sold its products to restaurants and farmers markets throughout the region, with all profits going back into improving conditions for workers. Marcus had also established an education program for the workers and their families. English classes were offered in the evenings, taught by volunteers from the local community college. Children of workers could attend summer programs that helped them with schoolwork and college preparation. The most meaningful part of the transformation was the memorial garden that Marcus had planted where the original bunkhouse once stood. 3 oak trees marked the spots where Eduardo, Jose, and Miguel had been buried. Between the trees was a small fountain with a plaque that told their story in Spanish and English. Local school groups often visited the memorial garden as part of lessons about immigration and workers' rights. Marcus would tell the students about the 3 men who had died seeking a better life, and about the importance of treating all people with dignity, regardless of where they came from. Marcus received regular letters from the families in Mexico. Maria Morales, now 90 years old, still wrote to him every few months. Her letters were filled with gratitude and updates about the scholarship program that had been established in Eduardo's memory. Several young people from the village had been able to attend university because of the scholarships. Carmen Santos had passed away 6 months earlier, but her children continued to correspond with Marcus. They had visited the ranch once, bringing their own children to see where their father had worked and died. It was an emotional visit, but also a healing one. Rosa Hernandez, Miguel's mother, had become an advocate for migrant workers' rights in Mexico. She spoke at conferences and meetings, telling her son's story and urging better protections for workers who traveled to the United States. She credited Marcus with giving her the strength to turn her grief into action. The ranch had attracted attention from around the country. Journalists had written articles about the memorial farm and its mission. Documentary filmmakers had made a movie about the discovery of the bodies and the transformation of the ranch. Universities sent students to study the farm's programs and learn about ethical labor practices, but the recognition that meant the most to Marcus came from the workers themselves. Many of the men and women who had worked at the memorial farm returned year after year. They brought their families to visit and spoke of the ranch as a place where they felt safe and respected. This is what America should be, one worker named Carlos told Marcus during the harvest season. A place where people who work hard are treated with dignity, no matter where they come from. Marcus had also developed relationships with other ranchers in the valley who were interested in improving their labor practices. He organized meetings where farmers could share ideas about worker housing, fair wages, and legal compliance. Some ranchers were resistant to change, but others were genuinely interested in doing better. The success of the memorial farm had led to expansion. Marcus had purchased 2 adjacent properties and was developing them using the same principles of fair labor and sustainable agriculture. The goal was to create a network of ethical farms throughout the region. Sheriff Morrison often stopped by the ranch to check on progress and share updates about the investigation. Although the case was officially closed, she continued to receive occasional calls from other law enforcement agencies working on similar cold cases. The techniques used to investigate the memorial farm murders had been shared with investigators across the country. "You've done something remarkable here," Sheriff Morrison told Marcus during one of her visits. "You took a place that was marked by violence and turned it into a symbol of hope." Agent Chen had also become a regular visitor to the ranch. She had retired from the FBI and now worked as a consultant on cold cases involving crimes against immigrants. She used the memorial farm case as an example of how communities could work together to seek justice for forgotten victims. "The supernatural aspect of your story is what gets people's attention," Agent Chen told Marcus. "But the real miracle is what you've done with this place since then. You've created something that honors the dead while helping the living." On the anniversary of the discovery of the bodies, Marcus held an annual remembrance ceremony. Workers, community members, and visitors from around the country gathered at the memorial garden to honor Eduardo, Jose, and Miguel. The ceremony included music, prayers, and speeches about workers' rights and human dignity. This year's ceremony was particularly special because Father Gonzalez had traveled from Mexico to participate. Now in his 70s, the priest had become a close friend to Marcus, and a strong supporter of the Memorial Farms mission. Eduardo, Jose, and Miguel did not die in vain, Father Gonzalez said during his speech. Their deaths brought attention to injustices that still exist today. Their memory lives on in this place, where workers are treated as human beings, deserving of respect and fair treatment. As the ceremony concluded, Marcus walked alone to the memorial garden. He often came here in the evenings to think and remember. The 3 oak trees had grown tall and strong, their branches providing shade over the fountain. The peaceful sound of flowing water had replaced the ghostly voices that once haunted this place. Marcus thought about how much his life had changed since that first night in the bunkhouse. He had inherited a ranch expecting to sell it quickly and return to his old life in Texas. Instead, he had found his true calling. The work was hard and sometimes frustrating, but Marcus had never felt more satisfied with his life. The ranch employed 40 people year-round now, with additional seasonal workers during planting and harvest times. Every worker had access to health care, legal assistance, and educational opportunities. Their children attended local schools and were encouraged to pursue higher education. Several former workers had used skills learned at the Memorial Farm to start their own businesses. Marcus had also found personal happiness he hadn't expected. He had married Elena Vasquez, the woman from the Mexican consulate who had helped coordinate the family's visit. Elena had left her job in Mexico City to move to Montana and help run the Memorial Farm's educational programs. They had 2 young children who were growing up bilingual and bicultural, learning about both their Mexican heritage and their American home. The ranch had become a gathering place for the community in ways that Elias Rodriguez never could have imagined. Local families brought their children to visit the animals and learn about farming. High school students worked part-time at the ranch during summers, learning job skills and earning money for college.